There was a time, I could say once upon a time, this began 2 decades ago, when I was doing archival research in a library in London, usually for a few days at a time, and I had some research funding for that. I was doing research on medical examiners who were called to testify in trials of infanticide. I was way deep in my research at that time. And in early September 2012, I was on one of those trips. And I was done with my days in the library, and I took a free day to visit my family in Kettering. That's about an hour by train from London. How convenient. It turned out that only my son was at home. He had no idea what I was going to do with him. So he asked me how I wanted to spend the day, and I said, I want to go to Leicester. I had just heard on NPR radio that there were excavations going on in a parking lot in Leicester to search for the remains of King Richard III. And a promising skeleton had just been located. I was convinced that that was indeed Richard III, and that I wanted to see the hole in that parking lot where the skeleton was found. I convinced my son to go with me. So we drove to Leicester. We didn't know exactly where to go. Leicester is not a small town, but we looked in the downtown area. There was no address given in that news story that I had heard, but there had been mention of the fact that the search was going to be in an area where the possible ruins might be. They wouldn't be visible, they would be underground, but the ruins of a Greyfriars church in what a parking lot is called in Britain. It's a car park. So we wandered about looking for the right car park. There are lots of them in Leicester. It was a bit rainy, typical for England. And finally, after a long time, we saw a street that was named after the Greyfriars, and we thought, well, that's promising. And then we saw an entrance to an enclosed car park, and there it was, a hole in the ground. We walked up to it, and we looked over the edge into the hole. By then, when we were being all excited about it, a couple of people that were using the car park were looking at us in a strange way. The story had not yet become major news, and they must have been wondering who would want to peer excitedly into a muddy hole in a car park while it's raining. Yeah, that was us. Now let's back up a bit and think about what most of us learned about Richard III, who died in the Battle of Bosworth, close to the city of Leicester, in 1485. Our history classes, and probably those of yours who are older as well, pretty much portrayed Richard III like William Shakespeare had done in his play. A greedy hunchback, an ambitious, murderous usurper who had 2 princes, the nephews of the previous king who had died, who had them killed in the Tower of London, and who was cowardly offering his kingdom for a horse at the end of the play. You all know those lines, or at least can paraphrase them, and some of us have used them in jokes. I always felt sorrow for this poor king, the king on a battlefield with his deformities, having to wear a suit of armor. That must have been very difficult. But there he was. And that's still in the play. Now, since Shakespeare was described as a contemporary of Richard III, his words were not considered as fiction. They were accepted as a poetic retelling of the true story. But Shakespeare lived he wrote that story 100 years, more than 100 years after Richard III had died. And what's more important, and probably more relevant, Shakespeare did most of his writing under the auspices of Elizabeth I. She was a Tudor monarch, the last of the Tudor monarchs in England. So he was in the pay of the Tudors. Richard III was not a Tudor. He was from the Plantagenet dynasty. In fact, he was the last of that dynasty, and he lost his crown to Henry Tudor, who then became Henry VII. And this battle is so typical for those times. There were little armies here and there that were supposed to be allies of one side or the other, and there were two rather significant armies that were on the side of the king, who had watched what was going on and decided which side they were going to either stay with or defect to. And one of them was the Stanleys. No hard feelings to anyone whose name is Stanley. These are different Stanleys, but they are known to be among those. And Richard III was surrounded and killed. Yeah. So Shakespeare was describing history as written by those who come out victorious in a battle. And that battle of Bosworth was the one that ended the War of the Roses, as it's called. If you know that history well, kudos to you. In my family, it's only my granddaughters in England who live there who know all those Edwards and Henrys, and they can rattle them off, and they actually have a song that they can follow so that they can remember those names. It's not easy. Not everyone accepted that story, that version that Shakespeare had written. Not all historians and not all people like us. And today I want to specifically mention a woman by the name of Philippa Langley. How many of you have heard of her? Yeah, she became fascinated with this king. She had seen the play like so many of us, and she had read a biography. There were very few things written about Richard III. Everything that you could buy in bookstores or see around, it was all related to Shakespeare's play, and it was a version of that. She started doing research. She was not an academic. I should say she is not an academic. She's very much alive. But she was not even a historian. She worked in marketing. So she totally, the story goes, she gave up her marketing job at an especially difficult time because she was getting a divorce too, and the income was needed. There's a long, long story related to that. But back to her research. She realized there was a lot in the accepted story that followed Shakespeare's play that did not really fit the profile of the evil usurper. And here are a couple of things. First, there was no reason to have those princes killed because they had already been declared illegitimate and they were not in the line of succession in any way. So why bother? And second, Richard III enacted several laws, and I'll just mention a couple, laws that showed that he protected the common people from the rich and powerful. That doesn't sound like that guy described in the play. One of those laws, probably the one he's remembered most for nowadays, is that one is to be considered innocent until proven guilty. Did you know that that came from Richard III? It did. And another one is that sentencing needs to be done without regard to a person's wealth or position. Sometimes he even intervened in court for a person who was not powerful and who needed to defend themselves. That doesn't sound like the Richard that I just described. There was also a popular story that Richard III, after the battle, that his body was brought to Leicester and that his remains were thrown in the local river. That's the River Soar in Leicester. However, there are quite a few pieces of evidence that this did not happen. The first of that is that Henry Tudor himself, Henry VII, his archival records show that he paid for a coffin, and it's recorded right there in his financial records. And second, there's an old map and tales related to that. It's not a very accurate one, and it showed a garden in Leicester in which there was a marker on a spot where the king supposedly had been buried a long time before in a Greyfriars church. And of all the possible places that this garden and that marker may have been, since 1975 it was already known that it could have been one of 3 car parks in Leicester. And Philippa Langley had a feeling that that location was in one particular car park, in the one that was next to the social services building. Now that I know where that was, after a long search, that car park and that church were actually very close to where the cathedral is now in Leicester. So it's not all that weird that she would think maybe this is the one. But she started talking to people at the university. Now you can imagine how this works. If you are a lay person, you don't have a PhD, you're not a well-recognized academic, and you want to talk to archaeologists about Richard III at the University of Leicester. I think, who are you? Well, and after your back, they'll say, you know. But she finally convinced archaeologists at Leicester University to work together and fund an excavation. And I can already tell you that this didn't totally work out well for her, because academics also tend to be rather possessive about findings. So when the whole thing was done, they said, we did it. But back to Philippa Langley. She was particularly drawn to one spot in that car park. It had the letter R painted on it. Do you know what that might be? It was reserved. In her mind, the R stood for Richard. So she pushed and pushed and pushed for the dig to start there. There wasn't much money available, so they said, well, where shall we start? She said, there, where the R is. And pretty soon, where the R was, they dug down, and they found a piece of a skeleton. They thought, oh, this is not worth it, let's just give up on the whole thing. That must be just some old friar or whatever. But she was convinced that they had to look more at that skeleton. And she asked, how much money is left in the budget? And they said, well, about £800. And she said, would that be enough to sort of continue revealing the skeleton? And they said, sure. So they kind of indulged her. But when they excavated that skeleton, it had battle wounds. Friars don't usually have those. This had battle wounds consistent with a song that described what had happened to Richard III on the battlefield, and that had become a very popular song. I'm not going to tell you what it exactly said. That's not appropriate for this place, but if you want to talk to me in the social hall, I can tell you more about it. The skeleton also showed severe scoliosis, a curved spine. So the person would have walked with one shoulder higher than the other, and would have had a painful time sitting in a saddle and being in a suit of armor, as you can imagine. But there was no such thing as a hunchback. That was Shakespeare. And then it wasn't just Philippa Langley, there were other people. There was an independent historian, John Ashdown Hill, who traced the descendants of Richard III via his sister. And you know, people in the same family all have the same mitochondrial DNA. He traced all those descendants to today. And 2 living descendants were located, and they were willing to provide their DNA to compare with the DNA that was extracted from a tooth from the skeleton. And yes, it was Richard III. Fast forward to more recent days, now Leicester has become a major tourist attraction. It wasn't just me anymore. The hole in the ground, you can no longer go see it because it's now part of a museum, and you can still look in it, but it's sort of all covered up, and there is a hologram of Richard III, the way he was found. Philippa Langley and John Ashdown Hill received the Member of the Order of the British Empire medals from Queen Elizabeth II. And on top of that, the monarchy's royal historical records no longer refer to Richard III as a usurper. He was entombed in Leicester in the cathedral. There was already a marker there that the Richard III Historical Society had installed, and I'd seen that years before 2012. It was right there in the floor, and it was very impressive. But now there's a tomb and an exhibit, and so much money has been gathered that the cathedral has undergone major renovations since 2015 when he was entombed there. The whole floor has been redone, and it's a great place for people who want to see Leicester and its history. And you can just cross the street and there's the museum. And if you want to know more about Richards and Henrys and Edwards, I have been there several times, and I always think, I got it now, but a few hours later it's gone again. And you know, I was just a few days in Germany and Belgium to visit my family. And we actually saw the movie. It's called The Lost King. It was a great movie that's sort of a documentary about Philippa Langley and what she did. And I was hyping up this whole story, and my son was there too, and we talked about the muddy hole that we were looking into. And the 2 princes. Philippa Langley has been obsessed with what really happened to the 2 princes, and she thinks, she has written a book about it, that those princes actually went to their aunt being one of the sisters of Richard III. That aunt is Margaret of York, and she became the 3rd wife of another very colorful character in history, Charles the Bold. He's called Charles the Bold. It's really a translation of the French word Charles le Téméraire, and téméraire doesn't mean bold, it means reckless. And he was the last Duke of Burgundy who was somehow trying to recklessly restore the Holy Roman Empire with him as at least the king of it, and that did not work out. In fact, he died a few years before Richard III did, on the battlefield in Nancy, and this is really weird. The wounds that killed him was identical to the one that killed Richard III. Now that gives me shivers. And Yeah, and his wife, Margaret, she could not be used, to check the DNA. That would have been very easy, but her bones somehow disappeared. They were buried in a monastery in Belgium. I always thought, why is Margaret of York in Belgium? Well, I hadn't made that connection with Charles the Bold. Now I do. And I don't know if those princes ended up living in Belgium, which would have been the Duchy of Burgundy, part of it at that point. More to be found out about that later, but it's very interesting. So let's sit back a little bit and think about us, Unitarian Universalists. We believe in the responsible search for truth and meaning. It behooves us not to merely take the words of powerful people as the truth. We must allow for the versions of stories that are told by those who are not powerful, those who are defeated, those who are on the other side, those who are on the margins of society. As individual Unitarian Universalists, we do much of this. And our umbrella organization, the UUA, has gone a long way in revisioning history to tell the stories of those who have been marginalized, oppressed, and have become victims of genocide. The books written by Unitarian Universalists and those published under the sponsorship of the UUA are really eye-opening. There's one written in 2009 by Leslie Takahashi, who published a book with the title, "The Arc of the Universe is Long." You know that expression. And the subtitle is Unitarian Universalists and the Journey from Calgary. That title refers to resolutions and commitments made by the UUA, especially the one at the General Assembly that was held in Calgary in 1992. And here in our church, in our congregation, we have already discussed several of the recommended books in that list that the UUA publishes about recommended books in revisioned history. Our anti-racism discussion group here at Beacon discussed Rosanna Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. And we also discussed How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. We discussed the Black women's history of the United States. And on February the 2nd, we will discuss the book On Repentance and Repair, Making Amends in an Unapologetic World. And this is a good reminder that telling the story, telling it more accurately, allows us to do things better in the future and to make amends where possible. The use of many perspectives and many different types and pieces of evidence makes for a nuanced, contextualized, comprehensive story. And this includes the stories that inform our paths in life, including our spiritual paths. So maybe we learn from such examples, learning about our past and become informed of the whole story of our lives and of other people's lives, rather than the mere one-sided narratives that uphold the values that are imposed by the powerful. May we make it so. Let us now rise in body or spirit and sing our closing hymn. It is hymn number 1007. That's 1007 in the teal hymnal. There is a river flowing in my soul.